Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LCK week number 6 overview and analysis video here in the spring split. We are really getting close to wrapping up the LCK split. We're in the second half of the round robin, as we kind of talked about at the end of last week, and so we're getting a very clear idea of where these teams are at. But lucky for us, there still are a lot of groupings that have yet to be determined in terms of where a lot of these teams are going to fall. We're going to get a better idea this week, and there's certainly going to be some upsets to go along with it, so I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below. As per usual, I want to know where you guys land on these teams and players, because there's so much going on in the LCK, and I know my opinions aren't the end-all be-all, so I'm curious to know what the general public's opinion of a lot of these players and teams are coming out of some weeks like this. But let's go ahead and get into the content itself. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and at the end of the week I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice neat little bow. We will of course be updating my personal power rankings from number 1 to number 10 at the end of the week as well, kind of talking about where I think teams are landing. And trust me, there are going to be some changes. I know it's not always the case here in the LCK with the amount of times there's just not a ridiculous amount of upsets, but I can promise there are going to be some updates to the power rankings at the end of the video. But most of today will be spent talking about the games themselves. So without further ado, let's get into the content. Let's get into day number 1, our first day of the LCK here in week number 6, already kicked off with a pretty important matchup for playoff qualification between BNK FearX and OK BRION. And it's kind of insane to say that about these two organizations, just considering, what the expectations for them were and just the general idea of where they're at. But they're sitting at 4 and 6, and right now I believe that puts BNK FearX in the playoffs, and bro, just outside of it. And with this win for BFX, it really kind of catapults them up into a playoff spot, into fighting it out for top 6, with a lot of the other teams kind of around that area really underperforming. Top 5 feel pretty locked in terms of just who they are, maybe not the order that they're going to be in, but what teams are going to be top 5. But that final playoff spot is very much still achievable for a lot of different teams, and I think BFX did a great job in this series to kind of make a case that you shouldn't be dropping us in the past couple of weeks. I know we haven't been quite as good in weeks 5 and 4 as we were in the first 3, but we're still a team that you have to watch out for. And bro, a team I expected to really level up now that they brought in a jungler that I think is a massive upgrade. Maybe I was wrong about that. We will see moving forward. But let's talk about the games themselves. Player of the series, pretty obviously, is going to go to Diablo in the bot lane. I think that there is an argument to be made for Kellen. Maybe there's an argument to be made for Clear in this series as well. Both of them, I think, played really well in comparison to their opposition, but Diablo gets a pentakill in this series, and for the most part is the guy that they're just facilitating throughout every single second of the gameplay here, and that means that he is going to get player of the series. The only real shocking thing for me when it came to this is actually his first player of the series for me across this entire split. Certainly would have expected him to have more, considering BFX has overperformed what my expectations were. This is their 5th series win, and he's been a huge part of why this team has been good. He's the best player on this team, and I don't even think that's arguable. But the funny thing when you look at it is like, well, they've actually won a couple of series through Raptor in the jungle stepping up Clear. Kellen, I think I've given a lot of credit for things that have happened in the support position. I think the thing for me is that Diablo is always really good, but when BFX ends up actually winning games, when they're actually able to go out and beat teams, oftentimes it's because somebody else on the team steps up to, complement Diablo and complement what he's able to put out. So he's often not the one that's like standing out in their wins. He's always the one who's playing the best in their losses. That is definitely the case. And so I'm glad to finally give him a little bit of a reward here for how good his gameplay has been. But Diablo is awesome. I see a lot of people talking about him being somebody that could be a future star at this level. I definitely think that that's possible. We haven't quite seen an AD carry pop off like this in a little while. I think he's better than a lot of the other, AD carries that were on bad teams that performed well. A player like Jiwoo comes to mind from last year where, he was popping off for a bad Nongshim team. He finally gets the opportunity to play for a better Nongshim team, and it doesn't necessarily go according to plan. I think Diablo is a more talented player than Jiwoo was, and, I think there is a world where he can become a top 2 or a top 3 AD carry in the LCK if he were to move organizations. But man, there are a lot of good AD carries in the LCK. It's not just the ones that are already starting, because respectfully to him, he's not really an upgrade over any of the big four at the current moment. He's not an upgrade for Gen.G, HLE, T1, or DK in terms of, what he's offering. Maybe you could consider him an upgrade over aiming if you, really wanted to, push the boundaries there. I don't think even me as an aiming hater can say that. That's just not where it's at. And then you also have to take into account that, T1 has 2 starting caliber 80 carries at the LCK level. You've got players like Berserker that are on pretty tragic teams that theoretically should be doing better. I know that there are other options out there, but there are a lot of good 80 carries in the LCK, and Diablo, I think the interesting thing is that he's making a case to be one of the upper tier ones, and the pentakill obviously helps, but this team plays around him well, and his aggressive tendencies and his mechanical prowess definitely showcase that he can be a star moving forward. But like I said, it wasn't just him. I think Clear has continued to really step up a lot more in spring than he ever did in the winter split. He just feels a lot more comfortable, a lot more mentally checked in. I don't know what happened before the beginning of the year, but it really did not feel like Clear was even trying at the start of 2025. It's nice to see that that is at least a little bit different now. Kellen's been awesome all year. People will continue to hate on him because they've already pre-established in their own head that he's bad, even when they were wrong to do that in the first place, and now they're not able to accept that. A big reason why Diablo is having so much success and why the consistency has been there is because Kellen has been setting him up so regularly. Not that I think Diablo wouldn't be successful elsewhere, but the fact that we're really not seeing bad games is because these two are awesome in the 2v2, and that Tahm Kench was unbelievably good in game number 3. It actively completely shut down everything that Bro wanted to do. Vikla's still a little bit of an issue for me. Raptor can be pretty feast or famine, but was the better jungler here, which is a good sign. But for BFX, it all really just comes down to, can you be the best of the rest, which I think is totally possible for this team in the way that they are currently constructed. You can make an argument that of the bottom 5 teams, Diablo is the best player on any of those teams, maybe outside of BDD, right? He's the only other player that's going to be in that conversation, and maybe you, Cal, if you wanted to put him there as well, but Diablo has been on fire, and that's where BFX can really play through. And for Bro, I am a bit disappointed. I certainly did not expect this outcome for them. I shot them all the way up to number 6 in my power rankings. I kind of talked last week about how I would put my money on them being that final playoff team and figuring it out with Krako in the lineup over Hambach now. Well, Krako just came in this series and didn't play particularly well. He's going to get done of the series coming into the jungle. A lot of this is for the Nocturne in game number 3, but quite frankly, he just got out-pressured in terms of what Raptor was able to generate on the other side. Now, a lot of that is fixable, in my opinion, because I think part of that is Tahm Kench in game number 3 just making it basically impossible for the Nocturne to be able to play, but it's not like he played great on Wukong in game number 1. There's just kind of a lot going on, and Krako was not nearly useful enough to justify this. I still think in the long run, he's probably going to be an upgrade to Hambach, but these are the series that you absolutely have to win if you want to try and get that number 6 seed going into playoffs. I think you can talk about how Morgan was a lot worse than his opposition on the other side. Morgan has definitely been much closer to a below league average top laner this year than he has in the last couple of years, which is a bit disappointing to see. Him and Dudu, I always compared as players because I think they were on similar trajectories, both of them really underperforming this year, which is a bit tragic. Hype and Closer continue to be fine. Hype actually had a great game in game number 2 on the Misfortune to really be able to push them over the top. It feels like he's starting to find some of his confidence at this level. Things weren't all that great at the start, and people are still way too high on him in comparison to a lot of other players. All the KT fans want him to be, 80 carry Jesus, and he's just not that. He's not as good as Diablo was on the other side, but he's certainly, getting better, and I think that that's all you can really ask for out of a rookie. But, Polu's not a great support. He's not necessarily helping out in that instance. The Nico game was bad. Closer had one of his weaker series in a while going into a player he probably needed to dominate. It just wasn't a perfect series for Bro, and these are the kinds of, series that they need to win, the kind of games that they need to win, and to lose this, especially to a team like BFX, it's just disappointing considering where I thought they'd be. And for BFX, it's a really nice win. Hopefully they're going to be able to keep up the momentum and, be able to actually push to be the number 6 team that I had them in my power rankings at least before last week. Then moving on to our second series of day number 1, and this is our first big upset of the week, and it is a big one. It's Dplus KIA taking on KT Rolster, and KT is going to pick up not just the win here, but the 2-0 win. They're not going to drop a single game to Dplus KIA, who is in complete freefall mode, and obviously there's a lot going wrong with this team right now. There's a lot that you can point to for DK, but I think a lot of it is their schedule just getting a little bit harder. That being said, you can't excuse a loss to KT Rolster. This team is just completely fallen off the rails in terms of what's happening, and it's pretty easy to point out where the problems are. To me, it's not one player individually underperforming, although I think some of these players have crashed back down to earth. Showmaker, I don't think is, in good form right now. I think that that's fair to say. Beryl has been awful for this team over the past couple of weeks, one of the least valuable players in the LCK. Shiwu, I think, has certainly, become a little bit more of the rookie that we expected to get, but the overall package of DK is struggling, in my opinion, because this team's macro is just completely unacceptably bad, and that's why you brought Beryl in, because you were trying to fix the macro part of this game. I don't know what it is as a consequence for Dplus KIA, but their macro has just never been good as a unit, and that continues right now. But for KT on the other side, you make one more change, or at least like a redo, taking casting out, putting Perfect back into the top lane, and once again, like, I'm not going to sit here and say that I'm a genius or anything, but this upgrades the team, and Perfect is a lot better than people gave him credit for, and this is something I've been saying on the channel for quite a long time. I'm glad to see that kind of get proven right here, because Perfect is going to get player of the series for me. Broadcast gave it to BDD. I really love what BDD did in these games. I think that that's totally fair. I don't know how you could possibly give it to anyone other than Perfect in this series, and I think the funny thing is, when you look at their LCK tenures, you would be like, oh my god, Shiwu losing to Perfect, that doesn't really make a lot of sense, but this is kind of how it went down in the Challengers League for a long time. Perfect was the player in the Challengers League that I thought was the most interesting to watch. Even when somebody like Thanatos was there as a top laner, Perfect was a player that I was always like, you got to keep an eye out for this kid, because mechanically speaking, he is a carry player. He can take over games if he's put in the right situation, and on KT, it just never really seemed to click that way. They always wanted him to play weak side, and it never really ended up working out for him. He's finally given some more keys to the kingdom in his return to the LCK, and he pops off. I get that he played Rumble and Gwen in this series, and that's obviously a little bit easier for some people to pilot, especially with where those champions are at, but Perfect was incredible, and I think it's pretty clear that this is the starting five they should go for moving forward. We already talked about how Dectum was a big upgrade over Paddock when he was in the lineup, because Paddock just is way too aggressive for this team. He doesn't really fit the identity for what they're looking for, and I do think Peter is significantly better than Wei in the support position. They're finally starting to find a starting five that can feel comfortable, and Perfect is a big part of that. Also worth noting, Cuz goes deathless in this series, playing Nidalee, playing Wukong, playing these aggressive champions. Cuz has been awful in 2025. To me, one of the biggest reasons why KT has been underperforming so much is that Cuz has genuinely just been a significantly below average jungler in terms of the production that he's been able to put out. If he can start getting on track, things are going to fix real quick. BDD was very good and was definitely better than Showmaker on the other side, but I don't think he was the main character. I think he was a great facilitator for what the rest of the team wanted to do. Dectum was super consistent down in the bot lane. Peter has been an upgrade in terms of aggressiveness and, playmaking potential, because Wei was just the worst player in the LCK, like truly unplayable at the support position. Overall, KT looks so much better now that they're finally starting to find some semblance of consistency, and this is coming off of a week that was disastrous for them. I dropped them into the bottom 2 in my power rankings, and here they are pulling a big upset off of DK, but for Dplus KIA on the other side, it's just not good, man. Like, everything is falling apart for this team. Their macro is unplayable. Like, it is genuinely the worst that I have seen in a very long time, and people have always complained about DK's macro. When Kellen was the support for the team, he was constantly getting replaced because the team didn't like the direction the macro was heading, whether it was Moham, whether it was Bible, whoever it ended up being, for the team coming into the support position. It never really ended up making it better. In fact, they pretty consistently made their team worse by making those decisions, but as we can see here with Kellen leaving and Beryl coming in full time, it's just gotten even worse. I would argue that this is significantly worse than anything DK has been in the past, and Beryl's going to get dud of the series for it once again. Not only is the macro awful, and as far as I'm aware, Beryl is the primary shot caller on this team, but he individually played really bad, and I meant it when I said that Beryl has been one of the least valuable players for this team over the past couple of weeks. Man, does this remind me of 2022, 2023 Beryl that just couldn't really find any sort of consistency in a lot of these situations, and I know that people are going to point to how successful he was at international tournaments during that period, but go watch my regular season reviews of 2022 DRX. That guy was actively running it down, and he's doing it once again. I don't think it's quite as bad, maybe, as it has been in previous years. He's not insta-losing games for teams in the way that he has been in the past, but he's certainly not adding to these teams. He's not making them better, and I think that that's fair to say. Aiming is just, he's a byproduct of whatever his surrounding core is. If his team is doing bad, he's not going to be able to carry teams to wins. That's just who Aiming is. He's like an upgraded, ascended version of what Teddy is as a player, and I think that that's totally fine. Mechanically speaking, he's great, and he's not going to make major mistakes, but he's not going to generate leads himself. He relies on the other players on the team, and Showmaker is now losing in the mid lane. Lucid just got out jungled by Cuz. Shiwu was losing on the top side to Perfect. Like, things are just falling apart everywhere for DK, and it's just not good. This team's below 500 in terms of their record right now. They are only one series above KT Rolster, and like, that should go to show you just how far this team has fallen from being undefeated in the regular season in the winter split to being mediocre at best here. I mean, they moved down to number 5 in my power rankings last week. I feel very justified in putting them there. And for KT on the other side, this is obviously a really nice win. We need to see them carry this through. Perfect looked awesome here. What's going to happen when they can't play through topside? Can they generate the same kinds of leads? It's going to be interesting to see how that ends up going, but this is the kind of win that KT needs in order to start getting their confidence back up and to even really keep them in the race. Then moving on now to day number 2, and we kick off day number 2 with a matchup between T1 and DRX, and T1 is going to pick up the 2-0 victory here. They're going to dominate, but really the big headline to grab after this series is Faker finally getting his second career pentakill. His first one was, what, a decade ago, 10 years ago in 2015 against Najin when he was on LeBlanc, and now he gets another one in 2025 against DRX when he is on Ahri. It's been a long time coming for Faker to be able to get to this point once again, and we're going to talk about him. It wasn't just the pentakill for him in this series. He dominated. I can't remember a domestic series where he looked like this in many years. Honestly, maybe ever since covering the channel. This might be his best domestic series in the regular season I've ever covered for these LCK weekly reviews. But for DRX on the other side, it's obviously pretty unfortunate to run into the buzzsaw that was T1 in this series, because they were really starting to kind of put on some, I would say, synergy in the past couple of weeks, or the past week. Ever since LazyFeel came in and replaced Teddy, it felt like this team was starting to find their identity. They were awesome going 2-0 last week, and they just could not keep that momentum up. T1 strikes them down without any sort of hesitancy, and it was dominant. So we'll quickly go through this, but for T1, come on, man. Player of the series is obviously Faker. This wasn't even in consideration to go to anybody else. I guess theoretically you could think about Owner in this series because he was so much better than Sponge on the other side, but Faker just decimated UCal in the mid lane. The best player for DRX gets absolutely obliterated by Faker, and on top of that, he's able to dominate all these team fights. We talked about the pentakill because that's the thing that I think a lot of people are going to be thinking about for him moving forward, but it wasn't just the pentakill. It's like he was dominating every single aspect of that game leading into that as well. The Ahri was just unbelievable. And it's not like the Victor was any worse. He also dominated game number 1 and was really good in that game, even with UCal being a little bit more contained. But it was really that game number 2 where he blew everything wide open, broke the entire game wide open, and made it very easy for T1 to be able to take it. This is Faker's best performance in quite a long time domestically. Again, I say domestically because we've seen World Finals, right? Like, World Finals last year, I think it's fair to say, was kind of on this level in terms of what Faker was capable of accomplishing. But in terms of the regular season, like the regular back and forth performances, like, Faker just doesn't play like this domestically in the LCK typically. So to see it out of him here is pretty massive. Owner continues to be arguably the best jungler in the LCK. In fact, I would kind of go to bat for him being that in terms of production right now, which is insane considering I've been a bit of an Owner doubter. But there's just no way to doubt what he has been in 2025 so far. He's doing everything that he's supposed to do as a primary carry, as a primary facilitator, whatever he needs to be, he is executing on it well. And Sponge, especially Sponge, really stood no chance in this matchup, a player that has definitely struggled when the enemy jungler actually plays the game. Doran was fine. Gumayushi had all of these resources put into him by specifically Rich in game number 2, which we will talk about, that kind of went in T1's favor in that regard, even if he was dying first in a lot of these team fights. Most of the time it took way too much in order to get him there. Therefore, things became less useful, and Carry, I thought, was perfectly fine in this series. Overall, it's just hard to take anything else away from this series other than, man, this Faker guy's pretty good at League of Legends, huh? And it's really nice to get reminded of that every once in a while. And then for DRX on the other side, they didn't stand a chance. Like, this was not even remotely close. There was no interesting conversation to have about any of these players or any of the moments that they had in this series. I think the only thing interesting to talk about is that LazyFeel continues to be really aggressive, but that honestly bit him in the butt a couple of times throughout this series. Dud of the series for me is going to go to UCal. I think this is up in the air between the solo laners, at least in my personal opinion. It could go to UCal for that game 2 on the Talia. To me, that's easily the worst individual game that anybody played on DRX in this series, and Faker just got such a gigantic lead on the Ahri because of it, that there was really no way for UCal to be able to stay in the game, which is unfortunate because, like I said, he is probably this team's best player. He's the one that's been able to carry them more consistently, but I'm just not going to mince words. He's been significantly less valuable, like doubly less valuable in spring than he was in winter, and certainly than what he was for Thunder Talk the past couple of years over in the LPL. He's playing the worst league he has in a very long time right now, and that's just not a really great place for him to be. I think you could also give this to Rich on the top side because he just completely AFK abandoned his team in almost every fight. He gets run off the Rift in game 1 on the Rumble, and then as Sion with resources in game 2, all he does is just try to permakill Gumayushi on repeat and just kind of ignores the rest of his team, getting absolutely blown back by the Ahri Nocturne combo. Just feels very strange considering he is the peel of this team for the most part, so not a good series for Rich, not a good series for UCal, and not really a good series for anybody. Sponge got outplayed here even on some carry junglers where he was supposed to be like a primary option. Already talked a bit about Lazy Field, but Ondel was also not very good in this series on these engaged tanks. Like, DRX just looked mega outclassed. Now it's T1, so you don't want to freak out here. They could still be a team that competes for top 6 or top 7, but they need to start climbing themselves out of this hole, with KT picking up a win earlier this week that they weren't supposed to get. DRX is in a worse spot than maybe they anticipated going into the week from a standings perspective, and for T1, 7-4 is accurate, right? This team might not be on the level of the top 2 right now, but they are right up there in terms of what you can expect them to hopefully turn into by the end of the split. Like, the consistency is not quite Hanwha Life or Gen.G levels, but the talent definitely is. We've seen that regularly, and I'm sure this team wants to make as much of a push as possible to get themselves to MSI. Then moving on to our second series of day number 2, and the undefeated run continues as we see Nongshim RedForce taking on Gen.G, and Gen.G picks up the 2-0 victory, and they do it once again in unbelievably dominant fashion. There's just no way to shut down this team consistently right now. They are so much better than every other team that they're going into, and that included Hanwha Life at the beginning of the split. Let's not forget that they destroyed them as well, but especially anybody not named HLE. There's just no shot. Like, Gen.G is so far and away the best team in the world right now, and hopefully they're going to be able to keep this up. We've seen this story from them before, and they've not been able to pull a championship out of it, a world championship, I should say, out of it. They've gotten plenty of LCK titles, but at this point, we're just hoping and praying that this team can make an international, push, and that's really what the goal has got to be. For Nongshim, it's obviously unfortunate to get your pretty decent roll shut off here. You move down to 6-5 in terms of your record, but how can you be frustrated losing to Gen.G? Like, at the end of the day, it's Gen.G. This is not a team that you can just go out there and compete with. They've only lost 3 games, all split, and no series. They moved to 11-0, 22-3. So we'll quickly talk about it. Like, player of the series was incredibly difficult, if only because every single player on Gen.G is just destroying their own opposition right now. Ironically enough, the only 2 that I kind of, counted out of this running were Chovy and Keem. Chovy is running away with MVP. I don't even think it's really all that much of a discussion right now. He's been the best player in the world so far in the spring split, and obviously that's fantastic for him. But Keem, didn't really need to generate a ton of leads on the top side. A lot of pressure was put elsewhere on the map. If you wanted to give it to Canyon, especially for game number 1 on the Xin Zhao, I'm certainly not going to fight you on that. I think that that's an entirely acceptable answer. But I really want to shout out the 2v2 in the bot lane. I shouldn't even say 2v2, the 2v5 that ended up happening throughout a lot of this game on the bottom side of the map for Ruler and Duro, that they ended up just straight up winning. Like, Duro's player of the series for me. I think it's entirely fair to give this to Canyon or Ruler, but Duro was just so ridiculously impressive to me in these games, and I hate to say that, like, oh, I'm so proud of being right, because it looked pretty bad for me in the winter split because I was so on board with Duro coming in as the starting support for Gen.G. To me, this is what they did with Delight, except I think Duro is a better player coming into Gen.G than Delight was coming into Gen.G. Now, Delight has obviously turned into a phenomenal player that's right up there with any support in the world, but Duro can be there right now. I don't think he needs as much time as Delight needed in order to get comfortable at this level. It's actually absurd how good he is, and credit once again to Gen.G for being so willing to say, all right, this guy was really good, an all-pro caliber player, even though it was only for half a split in summer. We trust our process, we know what we like to see, let's bring him in and make him our support for the future, and they've hit. Like, they definitely have hit on Duro, who has been everything and then some for this team. But Ruler also has been fantastic. I think he's been especially good in the past couple of weeks. He was unbelievable last week, player of the week in the LCK for me, and He follows that up with a phenomenal Kalista game in game number 2 to bounce off of the playmaking that Duro can create on the Renata. He's just great in every phase of the game. He's still the best mid-game skirmisher in the world, regardless of role. There's just nobody who does it quite like Ruler. You want a 3v3 in the mid-game for grubs, and Ruler is there, you're just instantly going to lose. He's better than everybody else at that specific role, and it's one of the most important roles in the entire game. Canyon was incredible, like I said, mega gapped Gideon, and it's not like Chovy and Keen were bad. Like, Chovy was still excellent, but this time much more, a passenger, I would say, overall, like a facilitator, I think is the more, I guess, proper word to use describing what Chovy was in this series, but Gen.G is unstoppable if they're going to play up to their own level. And for Nongshim on the other side, I love this team. I think that they're in a good spot. Calyx has come in and really stabilized the middle of the map, which has allowed a lot of these players who were already playing really well to keep growing, like Gideon and Kingen and Lehens, but, Gen.G is a different animal. Like, you can't expect a team, even as interesting as Nongshim is, to come in and be able to compete with Gen.G. Nobody can right now. Dud of the series for me is going to go to Gideon in the jungle. I love Gideon. I think he's arguably been a top 3 jungler in the LCK across this split, but Canyon was on one here, and I think Canyon's kind of reinserting himself into that upper echelon. Not that he's been bad, just that I think, a lot of the focus for Gen.G has been on other aspects of the team, but Gideon is just not able to hold up his own on Poppy and Sejuani against a really aggressive version of Canyon, specifically in that first game. I think that there was a lot of talk about Calyx coming into this series because of just how much of a prodigy he kind of is for them and just how much he's been hyped up as kind of a savior and a potential future star mid laner, but he's not a current star mid laner. Calyx is not on the level to be able to go up against Chovy regardless of what some super passionate Nongshim fans were hoping to see out of this series, and that's okay. Calyx was entirely ineffective, but it's against Chovy, so you live with it. Jiwoo has been a little bit disappointing, but honestly, he was fine in this series. To me, he kind of is the weak link of this team right now, which is saying something because I think he is a good player, but he's more so been an average AD carry at this level. I think that was exposed. Lehens was certainly not able to get anything going. He's addicted to elite support at this point. He's going to play it in literally every single series that he possibly can, and once again, against good teams, it's just not going to work out. That has consistently been the thing for Lehens and for elite support in general, and Kingan's one of the best top laners in the league and actually played relatively well, but there was no way he was going to have enough resources to take over in a game like game number 2. Like, the York was never going to be in a spot where he could actually just carry it. So for Nongshim, it's fine. Like, you end up losing to Gen.G. You hope you can bounce back later on in the week, but for Gen.G, you're just unstoppable. The number 1 team in the LCK, the number 1 team in the world until proven otherwise. This team has felt completely untouchable so far in the spring split, and there's been no sign of slowing down. Then moving on now to day number 3, our middle day here in the LCK in week number 6, and we kick day 3 off with a matchup between the DN Freecs and KT Rolster. The two teams coming into this week, bottom 2 in my power rankings, but KT is really starting to find their groove. Now, this isn't quite as impressive of a win as they had earlier this week over Dplus KIA, because DNF and DK are very different teams in very different stages, but for a 2-0 week to happen for a KT team that has not been able to find any consistent success, that's already a massive win. For DNF on the other side, they're like the anti-Gen.G, where it's like, oh, Gen.G is unstoppable, this team can't lose, and there's no way to take them down. DNF cannot win. They cannot overcome their own demons. They're getting blown back by KT. Both of these games were sub 27 minutes. Just majorly disappointing, and that's with putting their supposed best starting 5 back in. I would push back against that idea because I think some of these players are just quite bad, but we'll go ahead and talk about it when we get to them. Starting with KT Rolster. Player of the series is once again for me going to go to Perfect on the top side, and maybe this isn't going to be quite as popular of opinion as it is for the first series against DK, but I think Perfect was awesome. He did everything he was supposed to do in this series. The Jace in game number 1 was really dominant. He was doing a ton of damage to be able to pressure out this early game comp that they drafted for themselves and make sure that the Pantheon Talia on the other side didn't have the priority necessary to play the game. I thought Perfect was actually a much bigger part of that game than he gets credit for, and watch the Yorick in game number 2. Maybe if you're just looking at the box score, maybe it's not quite as impressive, but Yorick has not been a particularly successful champion so far in pro play. A lot of teams have picked this champ only for it to do not nearly as much as they're looking for. Perfect ends up being exactly what Yorick is supposed to be. He pulls so much pressure throughout the entirety of the game. He ends up pushing into the base multiple times, and when they do end up finally killing him for the first time in game number 2, it takes every bit of resource that they have, and so he ends up just actively winning the game for his team on the spot. It's genuinely insane stuff. Perfect looks incredible as a reinsertion here into the top lane for them, and hopefully he's going to be able to keep this form up. Again, I was a huge fan of Perfect in the Challengers League. It's nice to see that some of that still can translate to the LCK. course, you do want to point out the other members of this team, but to me, it's not the ones you would expect. BDD is obviously great, and I do want to give him a shout out because once again, he was very good in this series, but once again, very similar to the DK series, I don't think he was the main character in terms of where things went through for KT. I think Cuz was incredible in this series. I think he got the broadcast player of the game, or player of the series, and I certainly can't entirely disagree with that. He was great on the Nidalee in game 1, but it's that Wukong game in game 2 that people are going to get enamored by. And then Dekdom playing facilitative, utility AD carries like Ashe and Jhin has really started to find a niche and a role on this team. And you know what? He was always really good on these champions back in the day. This is why Nongshim had a ton of success when he was a rookie. This is why he was good on DK when they could play around Canyon and Showmaker. He could create his own, I guess, advantages on the bot side. He didn't need to get these gigantic gold leads. He could just be a very consistent piece for these teams and allow the rest of these players to really put resources into themselves. And Dekdom was awesome in this series. Majorly gapped Berserker on the other side, who I think a lot of people would consider a better AD carry than him. So credit to Dekdom. Again, BDD was good. Peter was also fine, but Perfect, Cuz, and Dekdom were the standout players for KT for me, and that's a really good sign. And for DNF on the other side, this team is just awful. Like, there's nothing else even really to say. At this point, whoever you want to give dud of the series to is kind of up to you, but honestly, for me, I'm giving it to Berserker in the bot lane because I genuinely do think this is the worst that he's looked all year, and maybe this is an unfair way to kind of talk about Berserker because he's been the one player on this team that I don't think has looked like an absolute train wreck in 2025, but I've gotten so used to Pioshik and Life and even like Dudu on the top side just being really bad for this team that when Berserker ends up playing really bad and getting outplayed by Dekdom in particular on the other side, it stands out even more, and it's more of a negative. So Berserker's dud of the series. I think he's going to be just fine. Like, as an individual player, I'm not worried about things ruining him. I saw a lot of comments where it's like, oh, NA ruined Berserker. No, I think DNF is ruining Berserker significantly more than Cloud9 ever did. So that's just my personal opinion. We will see how that ends up aging, but Pioshik and Bulldog are back in the starting lineup here. Pioshik, there's no excuse for. Void on the other side was perfectly fine. Like, he wasn't good for this team, but there's nothing to gain having Pioshik in the starting lineup. He's the worst jungler in the league now that Hanbok has finally been benched for Bro. And, Bulldog I get a little bit more because Pengyan in the mid lane for DNF has been atrocious, like even worse than what Bulldog was at the beginning part of this split. But Bulldog is also not a very good player, so it doesn't necessarily help their case there. Dudu had no pressure in comparison to Perfect. On the other side, Life couldn't really do anything. DNF is bad in every aspect of the game. There is nothing to praise, there is nothing to like about how this team played this. They got smoked by a team that had no chance of even buying a win before this week. Obviously, KT's on a little bit of a different trajectory now after the 2-0, but DNF, they're awful. There's nothing else to say. And for KT, is this a playoff team? Like, that's how thin the margins are right now. They're at 5-7. They're not all that far off from being where DK is, and depending on what happens with DK later on in the week, we could be looking at those two teams having the same record at the end of week number 6. That's how tight it is right now as a race in the LCK. So KT catching back on and finding their form is really nice. I just want to see them consistently be able to do it against teams that aren't DNF. But then moving on to our second series of day number 3, and this one again also pretty predictable. OK BRION taking on Hanwha Life Esports, and HLE is going to pick up the 2-0 victory here. Once again, just kind of pushing their way through. That being said, this is a lot closer than maybe it would look like on the scoreboard. The early game for Bro in game 2, very great. Morgan ends up getting a quadra kill. Shout out Delight, former Bro teammate of Morgan's, denying the pentakill early on in that second game, but unfortunately for Bro, that would absolutely be the highlight of the series for them, as they would basically have nothing else to go off of for the rest of this entire 2-game set, and Hanwha Life ends up really dominating in that regard. A lot of easy takeaways, in my opinion, from this series, and, a lot of pretty clear-cut things that we've already talked about for both of these teams. So, might not be the longest segment in the world, but let's go ahead and get into it. Player of the series is once again going to go to Viper, making a strong case to be considered the best AD carry in the world once again. I saw somebody saying he was the only adult in the room for a lot of the early part of this series, and I do kind of understand that. There was a lot of chaos happening. Zeka ended up just playing out of his mind in a non-positive way for a lot of the beginning part of game number 2, but he figured things out. He ended up coming back down to earth. Zeus ends up picking Nidalee top, which anybody who follows the channel knows Nidalee top is only playable because Yorick is overrated, and that's just generally how things have ended up going. And once again, he pulls back another win on Nidalee top when there's no reason for that champion to ever be picked. That being said, shout out Viper. He's really, really good at Ezreal, and I know that that's not any sort of new information. Viper has always been the Ezreal guy. When you think back to his time on Griffin, when you think to his time on Edward Gaming, it hasn't really mattered. He's always been the Ezreal guy, and I think He once again proved that here. He was dominant. He took over both games, even on the Kalista in game number 1, but it was his consistent damage that really kept the team in check when they needed somebody else to step up. Eventually, Zeka ended up getting there at the end of game number 2, and obviously Peanut was fine, Delight was fine, but really this was a Viper series and a big 80 carry gap, which we will talk about. Like I said, the other player to really shout out is Zeka, not because he played super consistent, but because he made the big play when it really mattered the most at the end of game 2. If that's not a great explanation for who Zeka is as a player, I don't know what is. He steps up when it really matters. You know, Closer's been a good player this year. He didn't really have a great week, all things considered, in week number 6, but Zeka definitely kind of the better version of Closer. I think these two players are very similar in terms of how they play the game. Zeka's just a little bit more, you know, experienced and definitely steps up in more big moments. Peanut continues to be really solid. Krako had a much better series than he had earlier in the week against BFX. Like, this was a much better showing, I would say, overall from Krako against a better, you know, crop of opponents. Not that he was still relevant, but, you know, Trundle is not a good champion, and then once he did get a good champion, he was at least kind of relevant in game number 2. He at least had some resources. He wasn't running the game or anything like that, but he wasn't running it down either. And those are kind of the two parallel traits that I need to make sure Krako doesn't run into against these top tier teams. So credit to Peanut, who I thought was good. Delight was fine, maybe not as good as his scoreline would indicate, but still generally fine. And Zeus, you know, he's Zeus, right? He picked Nidalee top, and that pissed me off, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. So for HLE, they're really good. Their only loss this split is to Gen.G, who's not been able to lose to anybody. So HLE is still right up there as a contender for best team in the world, and especially for a team that gets better going into playoffs, who's to say they're not going to be a team that figures it out even more so as we get into best of 5s. But for Bro on the other side, pretty easy conversation to have. Top side was good, bot side was not. Like, I hate to just make things so black and white because typically League is not black and white in that way, but Morgan was great. He ends up getting that quadra kill, and it's awesome that he's able to generate some resources. The Penta was denied, but Krako was also really not the problem in this series. It was the bot lane that really let this team down. Hype is the easiest possible choice for dead of the series that I could think of. It's unfortunate we were talking about him starting to find some confidence in their previous series earlier on in the week. That is all faded out. I can't, remember a game where there was worse bullet times than what we saw in game number 2. Once again, shout out to all the KT Rolster fans that are like, oh, we would be a top 5 team if we had Hype and an 80 carry. I think you guys are genuinely smoking crack. Like, there's just something that you're seeing that I'm not, that apparently, there's something in the air that I think people are breathing in, but I do not, the hype for Hype is not there for me. This guy's fine, and maybe he has some upside, maybe you can, tap into it, but this guy still has a lot of room to grow before he's like a competent LCK player, especially trying to play near the top of the standings. Closer was not nearly as good as his traditional season average this week. I think that's a big reason why Bro ended up really, underperforming what their, I guess, projected win total would have been, and then Polu is just not a good support. Like, he doesn't really do anything at a good level. He's average at a couple of things, and he's below average at a couple of other things. There's just not like a standout trait from Polu that makes him a good player. He just is along for the ride. So for Bro, again, pretty easy conversation to have, all things considered. Morgan and Krako were good. The rest of the team was not. If you're not going to be able to step up across the board, then you're not going to beat a team like Hanwha Life, who's just way too good in most areas. Viper is playing in incredible form right now. I think you could say the same for Zeus, who's an MVP frontrunner, and Delight, who's kind of getting up there as well. HLE is just crazy good. They would be the clear number 1 if Gen.G didn't exist, and I still think there's a chance they can get there by the end of the split. Then moving on now to day number 4, kicking off the back half of our week, and we had a great start to day number 4 here as we saw Dplus KIA taking on T1, and T1 is going to dominate here. They're going to pick up the 2-0, and they're going to look very, very clean in doing so. We wanted to see T1 really get into form over the course of the back half of this split, and they're doing exactly that. I'm not willing to say that they're exactly on the level of Gen.G and Hanwha Life just yet, but they're certainly the team that is by far the closest of anybody else in the LCK, especially in comparison to Dplus KIA, who is just crashing and burning right now. We just talked about it earlier on. Obviously, their loss at the beginning of the week to KT Rolster was bad, but now they're at the same series score as KT Rolster. They are tied for 5th place in terms of series score. Of course, there are a lot of tiebreakers that end up going in their favor because they've been pretty dominant in their wins, but they're below 500. They're 5-7, and they're below 500 in terms of game score at 14 and 16. I get that their schedule's been pretty hard, but there are some real concerning traits here for Dplus KIA. I think that there is a lot going wrong for this team, and again, it all comes down to macro, which I think is just really bad for them. So we'll go ahead and talk about it. For T1, player of the series is going to go to Owner. Big shout out to Gumayushi. This is the best series he has played since, fully coming back into the starting lineup for T1, and it's nice to see that he still has it in him to be able to take over games, but poor him, he gets targeted so heavily by DK at the end of game number 2 that he dies a couple of extra times. Owner gets to pop off in some of these fights on the Sejuani and gets to dominate on the Pantheon in game 1, and, he ends up winning player of the series because of that. But I do want to give a big shout out to Guma. You know, he was awesome, and he's honestly the first player I think of when I think about these games. So if you wanted to give him player of the series, be my guest. I'm certainly not going to be one to put a ton of stock into pushing that away, especially because he was super fed on misfortune going into Wukong and Braum and even Cassante or Varus. Like a lot of these champions that are generally considered to be like okay into MF, he was still incredibly useful in that matchup. So credit to Guma, easily the best games that he has played since coming back in. But Owner is just on a different level right now. Again, I've said that he's the best jungler in the LCK in terms of current production, and I'm certainly not going to shy away from that phrase after this series. He's just doing everything at a ridiculously high level. His early games are fantastic. His team fighting is the best in the entire league, and it's just really fun to watch. He sets up the rest of this team perfectly on things like Sejuani, or he can carry through a lot of skirmish potential with Pantheon. It does not matter. He's able to outjungle Lucid, who's been pretty good across this year. Not very good recently, which we'll get into, but Owner's been able to, you know, regularly out-jungle these really high-level junglers and really just showcase how talented of a player he actually is. So Owner kind of right there in the MVP conversation. To me, there's a big three in terms of where the MVP is at. Chovy is leading it, Zeus is in second, but Owner is right there in third, and I think those are the three players you're really looking at as most valuable player. Again, Guma definitely deserves a shout-out, but Faker also had another really solid series. Showmaker has not looked even remotely okay over the past couple of weeks, which is not a great look, but Faker kind of bouncing off of that fantastic series he had earlier on this week to follow up with at least another good one. Maybe not quite as eye-catching of a series, but still very consistent and very stable for Faker, which is nice to see in the regular season. Keria was a big reason why Guma Yushi had such an easy time, but I think Guma created a lot for himself as well. Doran was aggressive, and Shiwu was definitely worse than him on the other side. It all just is clicking for T1. A fantastic week, one of the best they've had all year. And then for DK on the other side, it's just so easy to talk about where the problems are right now. Their decision-making is legit like bottom three in the LCK, like even including the worst teams in the entire league. Some of them have significantly worse hands, so they're not able to compete in the same way, but DK makes the worst decisions I've seen a pro team consistently make in a very, very long time, especially one as talented as this team is. And, you know, part of that is going to be put on Beryl, but like it's just his gameplay that he's getting done of the series for. And I'm not going to start mincing words. Like he's starting to once again become the least valuable player in the LCK, and I think DK fans are actually getting a glimpse into like, oh, we wished for this. Like, I'm not going to try and call these people out because I really want to. Like, trust me, from the bottom of my gut, I really want to call out all of those people on Twitter, all of the last 2-3 years that are like, oh, we're bringing back Kellen, Barrel's right there. I can't believe KT got Barrel or DRX, went to get Barrel, all of this stuff. Like, if we had Barrel, we'd be the best team in the world. I hope you're getting some sort of reality check, wake-up call. This is who Barrel has been over the past couple of years. You're kidding yourself if you think that this is a gigantic upgrade. And honestly, I don't want to laugh at the circumstances, but I do find it kind of funny that DK was begging and begging, DK fans, I should say, were begging and begging and begging for this guy to come back. Well, here's what you wished for. You wished for this. You wanted this. And so take your 5-7 record and take Barrel being one of the least valuable players in the league. Like, this is what you were asking for over and over again. It's all yours. You can have it. His decision-making is awful. His gameplay was awful in this one. I can't remember a game where Braum felt as useless as it did in this one. You're playing Braum into MF and somehow you're not doing anything in the game. It's completely inexcusable. Barrel has been awful for this team, and there's nothing else really left to say on that front. Lucid continues to get out jungled on multiple different avenues. This reminds me so much of Spring Split Lucid from 2024, which is really not a great sign. It finally felt like he was going to be taking that next leap into being one of the better junglers in the world. That has completely crashed and burned over the past couple of weeks. Aiming had one of his weaker series in a while, mostly because Guma had so much pressure. I'm not entirely blaming Aiming, but he also is not a player that's going to be able to rise above his circumstance. Showmaker is constantly losing in lane. Shiwu is not nearly as aggressive as he has been recently. DK is crumbling and falling apart in every possible way, and it's disappointing. There's nothing else really to say. This team is disappointing and frustrating to watch, and T1 is more than good enough to be able to take advantage of that. They moved to 8-4 after the first 6 weeks. They are clearly in third place. The top two are pretty uncatchable in terms of where their records are at, and that really matters. As a reminder for the playoff format, it's kind of like an old school LCK gauntlet style playoff format, except the top 2 seeds play for immediate qualification. So 1 plays 2, whoever wins that instantly qualifies, and then the gauntlet ends up beginning with whoever loses that series between 1 and 2 and then down to number 6. So you want to be number 3. You want to get as high of a seed as possible so that you have to play as little series as possible to get yourself qualified for MSI and to be in that upper echelon. T1's going to get the chance to be able to accomplish that, and they're on a roll right now. Then moving on to our second series of day number 4, and we keep the good vibes train rolling for one team as we saw Gen.G taking on BNK FearX, and Gen.G is going to pick up the dominant, once again, 2-0 win. Now that being said, this series was somehow closer than the one earlier this week where they played against Nongshim. Obviously Nongshim, a team that should be better than BFX, but BFX put up a decent fight. Diablo is a good player, and so there's enough resources to be able to pull back to at least make one of these games interesting. In this case, it was game number 1, but once we got into game number 2 and we really got to see the full extent of Gen.G's, we'll just say aggressive tendencies, things definitely started to go a bit more south for BFX in general. So we'll go ahead and talk about it here. For me, player of the series is once again going to go to Duro in the support position. I'm not trying to take anything away from the rest of this team. Canyon was awesome once again, and he had a great week. Overall, we'll talk about the Zed game in game number 2 because everybody likes to hear about Zed jungle in terms of how it's performing, but Duro is the core of this team that's kind of making them click at the level that they are right now. I think these games would get a lot harder if he wasn't playing quite as well as he is at the current moment, but he's easily been the best support in the LCK. I don't even think it's really been all that up for debate. Delight was running away with things at the beginning of the year in the winter split, but I think as we've transitioned into spring and Gen.G has gotten even more dominant, Duro has been the player that has been able to stand out and be consistently carrying games in a lot of different ways, and he did it on both Rakan and especially on the Lulu in game number 2. You typically don't think of Lulu as a champion that can really stand out in that kind of player of the series way, but Duro was excellent on that champion and really made the most of a lot of his situations. Now, obviously, a lot of that is enabling Zed and Zeri to be able to take over the games, the double Zs to be able to, really dominate in terms of damage in the back half of this, but Duro was the one setting them up and creating a lot of the easy pathways that they needed in order to really dominate. Duro's been exceptional, and he's going to be in the running for player of the week. And then Ruler, of course, and Canyon both deserve big shout outs, I should say, for how they ended up playing in the back half here. Ruler obviously great on Xayah. It's his best champion ever, at least that's my personal opinion, and then he's always been great on Zeri as well. It's good to see him continue to play aggressive on that champion. Canyon looked great here for Gen.G. The Zed in particular was incredible in game number 2. Sometimes that champion looks entirely useless, especially in pro play. Nice to see that not necessarily go that way for Gen.G. Chovy mega-gapped Vikla in the mid lane, really was not even close, but once again, Chovy kind of playing a facilitator role. Ahri and mostly the Galio in game number 2, like, you're playing around Rumble, Zed, Zeri, and Chovy's playing Galio. That's how much they trust the rest of this team to carry, because Chovy's the best player in the world, and you're putting him on the one passive member of this entire team. It's really, really cool to see. Keen continues to be better than every other top laner he's run into, especially as of late. Gen.G's undefeated for a reason. They're sitting at 24-3 in terms of game score. They are basically unstoppable right now, and for BFX on the other side, they just have too many flaws. Like, I love Diablo. I think Kellen has a couple of good things going for him, but this team doesn't have the power to stand up to Gen.G. We think that that can happen. I saw a funny little thread comment, I guess, in the post-match thread on Reddit for Diablo, where, we've seen the copy and paste, Control-C, Control-V. Oh, Diablo, like, we want him on a top team. We want him unstuck. It's so unfair. This rookie is so good. I saw somebody call that out on Reddit. Shout out to you, whoever called that out on Reddit. I really appreciate someone being like, not every rookie is like, mega stuck. Like, it's year number 1 for a player that's been developing for BFX for a very long time. He's played a ton of pro games. This guy has been good for a while, and he's stepping up now. Like, it's a much more gray story than what a lot of people like to make it out to be. So, appreciate that the community at least has some people like that in there. But, yeah, Diablo is the best player on this team, and he certainly always performs the best in their losses. A little bit worse in game 2 than he was in game 1, but not really by a large margin. But Vikla is once again going to be getting dud of the series. If Beryl didn't exist, Vikla would be running away with the most dud of the series right now in the LCK, but unfortunately Beryl does exist, so Vikla is going to have to settle for second place. That being said, Vikla's not nearly good enough to go up against the actually good LCK mid laners. Like, this is the story. He could survive in the middle tier of the LPL, because if you're consistently playing like lower tier LPL mid laners, then things get a little bit easier. When you have to play Chovy and, BDD and Showmaker and, Faker and Zeka and even, someone like Calyx who has stepped up over and over again, when that's like your entire schedule, it's just not possible to survive as an average mid laner. It just doesn't happen. So Vikla once again is going to get dud of the series. He was bad here. Clear was also much worse than he was in the first series. Raptor got out jungled, although I don't think it was entirely his fault, and Kellen was way too far forward in a lot of these places, and Duro definitely outplayed him as a support, but Duro's been outplaying everybody, so gonna cut him some slack for that. For, BFX, this is kind of the result we expected. We didn't think they were gonna take a game off of Gen.G. It would have been cool if they were capable of doing that, but it doesn't end up happening. Gen.G is just a little bit better, maybe by a little, and they're able to get themselves over the finish line, and they're gonna end the first 6 weeks still undefeated. But that's going to bring us to our 5th and final day of action here in the LCK in week number 6, and we kicked off day number 5 with perhaps the biggest upset of the split. Up until this point, it was Nongshim RedForce taking on the DN Freecs. And somehow, someway, DNF is going to pick up their first series win of the 2025 Spring Split. They finally pick it up. They're not going to go 0-12. Nobody beats DNF 12 times in a row. They go 1-11 through their first couple of series. And quite frankly, this was a 3-0 in terms of how they played this out. They were probably better in game number 1. They just couldn't quite close it out. And then games 2 and 3, they were definitely better than Nongshim. There really was no debating on that. Nongshim wasn't really all that close in those games. So credit to DNF. This is a massive win to just give them some confidence. Obviously, they're plenty out of the playoff picture at this point. Technically, they're not. Technically, if they win out, it is possible for them to make playoffs. Some crazy things would need to happen, but theoretically, they haven't been mathematically eliminated, but they're about as close as you can get. Nongshim, though, what the hell happened, man? This is a team that absolutely should have been cruising to a 7-5 record, a top 4 placement, especially with a team like Dplus KIA struggling as much as they are right now. Instead, we're looking at Nongshim as okay, well, they're in the cluster. They're a lot closer to being in the cluster than maybe we want them to be. So that's definitely frustrating, but let's go ahead and talk about it here. For DNF player of the series, for me at the very least, is going to go to Life in the support position, mostly for that set game in game number 2. This guy is unbelievable on these off-meta support picks. He always has been a lot more comfortable on off-meta stuff. I think back to Rumble support last year that he really popularized in the LPL. He really created a big meta surrounding Rumble support, and obviously Rumble is still very valuable, but set as well is something that we knew from Life back in the day in the LCK. It was something he pulled out a ton, and so to see him pull it out in game 2 and really make it work was impressive, especially alongside something like Lucian that you would typically want an enchanter with. It's nice to see that kind of stuff can still work, and he was very good on the recon in game number 3 as well. Really good map presence and just playmaking ability. This is Life's best series of the year, and it's not even remotely close. This is a guy who has been pretty bad for DNF. Not that everybody hasn't been pretty bad for DNF, but specifically Life has not been very good for this team. He's gotten dud of the week, I think, a couple of times now, and it's nice to see him actually just genuinely have a good series in DNF's first win. But I think you can look at a lot of different areas for player of the series. I considered Berserker because he was kind of the follow-through with a lot of the damage, especially after earlier this week where he possibly played his worst series of the entire year. To have him come back out here and just mega gap Jiwoo as an AD carry on the other side is really nice. I think you could give this to Dudu on the top side. In fact, I think Broadcast did give it to Dudu on the top side, mostly for that Scion in game number 3, the Drifter, the Drift King on the top side. Really fun to watch him just be able to take over that game in that way. The only player that I don't think has an argument right now for me is Pioshik, and that's mostly because Gideon was fine on the other side, but Bulldog was even solid, was way better than Calyx in terms of how this matchup went. DNF just felt like a completely different team here. This felt like the DNF that ended up beating Nongshim, I believe, in week 1 of the Winter Split. I believe it was Nongshim that they took down. Maybe it was Bro in that matchup that they won at the beginning of Winter when, that first, I think it was the first game of the entire year in the LCK, something like that. DNF looked pretty good there. This reminded me a lot of that version. They just have not been able to recapture that form at all, and luckily at least we know it's still in there. I just don't know how regularly they're going to be able to pull it out. And then for Nongshim on the other side, it's unfortunate. This is not a result that you can possibly chalk up to being acceptable. There's no excuses for how this ended up going down. Dud of the series for me is going to go to Jiwoo, although it could go to Lehens in the support position as well. Life completely outplayed Lehens in this series. There was a gigantic support gap in terms of how things ended up going, and that's even with Lehens not on Elise, where he typically runs it down in a lot of his other games. It's crazy. But Jiwoo, man, this guy has felt kind of boosted across 2025, hasn't he? It's really not felt particularly good for this player, which is the unfortunate part, because there are 80 carries on bad teams that we've talked about. Berserker on the other side of this matchup, I think would be really interesting on this Nongshim roster. Someone like Diablo, we've talked about, would be interesting, but Jiwoo has just not been able to follow up his really good 2024 with even a remotely average 2025. He's been an average to slightly below average 80 carry for a team that's trying to make top 4, and that's just not good enough. He is the weak link of Nongshim right now, and it is a bit disappointing to be able to say that. Like I said, though, Lehens also deserves his credit for not playing well at all. You've got a Jinx in game number 3, and he's leaving him on an island to play 1v2 the entire game. It's just brain-dead gameplay from Lehens trying to outsmart the system and overthinking the problem and ending up putting his team in a worse situation because of it. Calyx ends up playing those final fights on Sylas as poorly as anyone has ever played any fight on Sylas, even if he was okay throughout the series up until that point. Kingen was not very good on the top side. He had no real answer to the Scion in game 3, and once again pulls out his kind of pocket pick in the Anivia top, and once again, it doesn't work. It's not something that's been particularly consistent for him either in 2025. Gideon was the only player with a pulse in this series, which is unfortunate because, you know, Pyosik is the kind of player you can exploit in terms of a 1v1 matchup, but the rest of the team was just not ready to follow up. So this is a bad loss for Nongshim, especially because they look so bad in game number 1 that they won as well. So they need to get back on track at the start of next week, or things are going to start getting a little bit more concerning for me. And for DNF, this is nice. It's cool to be able to pick up a win. I don't think it really matters for them. I think it's far too little, far too late for them to be able to salvage anything out of this split, but just the confidence of knowing you can win a series if you are put in the right spot, and if the enemy team ends up underperforming, that's hopefully enough to give these players something to play off of. But that's going to bring us to our final series of the week here in week number 6, and it was a predictably dominant one as we saw Hanwha Life Esports taking on DRX, and HLE is going to pick up the 2-0 win. Game 1 was what we thought it was going to be. It was incredibly dominant, not really all that interesting to watch, quite frankly, just everything we expected it to be, but game number 2 was a lot more interesting. I think that there are some takeaways, a couple of really good performances on the side of DRX. LazyFeel looks like a huge upgrade in the bot lane to what Teddy was for this team, and, you know, I know I've reiterated that point a lot, but LazyFeel is definitely better for what they are individually. Even if I don't think Teddy is a bad player, they need a player like LazyFeel that's going to be a lot more aggressive in terms of how he plays these bot lane matchups. And also, I think Sponge was pretty good here. I think the scoreline might make you think that he was a little bit over-eager and getting himself caught in too many situations, but he was pretty solid throughout this entire series. The issue was just that they didn't have a mid laner that could properly play Azir in game number 2, and it's just such a sad thing to say about DRX. I have a lot to say about it, so we'll save it for that section. But for Hanwha Life, you know, good win. Like, this is what you want to see. You want to see them come out here and be the better team. You maybe would have wanted game 2 to be a bit more clinical, and that was generally the case for Hanwha Life's, you know, both of their series wins this week, where both of them kind of felt like, okay, well, you 2-0'd, but you probably could have done it in a bit more of a dominant fashion. That being said, the 2 players that popped off earlier this week once again popped off and are continuing to be big positives for the team. So let's get into it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Zeus on the top side. This one, you know, I criticize the Nidalee top over and over again, but if anyone can get away with it right now, it clearly is Zeus. He feels super comfortable on this pick. He's playing it basically every series. Him and the Shy are just lockstep, and it's funny because I compared Zeus to the Shy like 2 years ago in terms of what I was talking about as players that are just ridiculously mechanically talented, that on a game-to-game basis you have no clue what you're going to get into because on any given day they can just not connect mentally. There are a lot of games that Zeus just doesn't care about, and he doesn't try in, and that was definitely the case on T1. It's been less of the case on HLE, although it kind of was at the beginning of winter and at the beginning of spring. I think once he started locking in, especially after week number 2 or week 3, it's basically just been fantastic from him. It's why he's right up there in the MVP conversation alongside Chovy in terms of, you know, where he's at. I think it's because he's just really locked in and kind of said, like, screw it, I want to prove myself to be one of the most valuable players in the entire world. We always knew he had the talent to do so. It's just nice to see such an extended period of time where he actually is delivering on a lot of that talent. So nice on him. Viper continues to look awesome. LazyFeel was definitely putting up a good fight on the other side, but Viper was incredibly clinical in this series, especially in game 2 on the Kalista. You know, Kalista's one of those picks that's kind of re-emerging. It was funny because Kalista's win rate at the beginning of the year was astronomically high. That champion had to be permabanned. It was incredibly good. Then it really dipped, like not just because of nerfs, but I think people got really accustomed to playing around it and just playing specific bot lanes to counter it. And I think now it's rising back up once again because I think a lot of people have realized, like, oh, you know, we just play around the Kalista and all of a sudden things get a little bit easier. It's not just this auto win 2v2. If we put a ton of pressure on the bot side, Kalista can still take over games. I think the pendulum has swung back in Kalista's favor. So credit to the champion, credit to Viper for being able to pilot it well. Maybe it's just the fact that good AD carries are playing Kalista again, and good AD carries just generally win games, but it is cool to see Viper have such a fantastic week. Zeka was much better in this series, I think, especially in terms of consistency than he was earlier. Peanut's awesome as a facilitator, get him on these things every single game, and Delight was fine as an engaged threat, especially in game 1 on the Rel. I think it was a little bit more up in the air on the Renata in game 2, but overall for HLE, just a really good team and a really good performance. And for DRX, at least they put up a decent fight. Like I said, LazyFeel and Sponge, there's a lot to like about their gameplay here. LazyFeel as an aggressive player that's going to try and be the primary option for this team, I think really fits in terms of what they want to do. And Sponge, I think, has been finding a lot better form so far in 2025. He had a great week last week. He was an honorable mention for player of the week in week number 5. So nice to see him carry that form over, even if he wasn't perfect this week. But unfortunately for DRX, the solo laners have just been disastrous. Rich was really not good in this series. He was completely countered by Zeus, but that's more to be expected. Zeus is arguably the most mechanically talented top laner in the world, and Rich is the worst laning top laner in any, you know, especially Eastern region right now. He just isn't very good in lane, but You cannot excuse UCal. You just cannot in the mid lane. He's going to get dead of the series once again. This guy has gone from being like an underrated star on Thunder Talk that's been able to carry them for a couple of years to being awesome in the winter split, genuinely dragging the corpse of DRX into a potential top 6 finish, to now being one of the least valuable players in the LCK. I genuinely cannot remember a fall off that happened this fast and this hard in the LCK. Like, the difference between UCal from 2 months ago to UCal now is just, it's not even, there's no comparison. He's a completely different player. He's making gigantic mistakes in the back half of these games. He's playing fights horribly. He's not generating resources. There's nothing else to say. I'm so frustrated because UCal was a player to watch out for, somebody that I thought was on like a BDD-esque trajectory where he was on a bad team, but he was doing everything he could to get that team across the finish line. It's all out the window now. He genuinely has been one of the least valuable players in the LCK, regardless of role, and there's just no excuses. So shout out UCal. Ondel continues to be one of, if not the worst support in the entire league. I get that Playta wasn't great when he got reinserted. Let him play with LazyFeel. Like, let him play as a duo with these guys, with LazyFeel, who's actually been really good for this team. Playta and Teddy didn't work. Let, LazyFeel and Playta work. That's just where I'm at in terms of that bot lane, but overall for DRX, the solo laners got to figure it out. This team started to look a lot better last week, and UCal and Rich were a big part of that, but they're not good right now, and they need to be better. Even if Sponge and LazyFeel are going to step up, you need the entire team to look competent if this team wants to make a race for top 6. And for HLE, like, at this point, they're 11-1. They're only, one series behind Gen.G. If they're able to pull off some sort of upset and end the split near similar records with Gen.G, I think they're going to feel positive about that, but this team is still favorites to win the LCK right up there with Gen.G. Whoever you want to put above, I think I can kind of understand. They were coming off of a first stand tournament that kind of took a lot of their time, but didn't necessarily creatively pressure them. I think they needed some time to get back into form, and I think slowly but surely they are still getting there. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCK week number 6 overview and analysis video here in the spring split. Up on the screen, the updated standings after 6 weeks of action, and somehow, some way, after week 6, we already have a couple of teams that are guaranteed for playoffs. Gen.G already qualified at the very minimum for the second round, which is insane, and Hanwha Life, of course, guaranteed for playoffs. If they were to lose every single game, the rest of the split, they would already be there, but right now they are running away with the standings, and they are likely to be the two teams that face off in that third round upper bracket series as an immediate qualification series. But we can talk about everybody else as well, and that's kind of reflected in my power rankings, which you can see to the right of every single team. Next to that's going to be changed. That's how that has changed from last week to this week. We can go over risers and fallers. I didn't want to make any changes on the top side of the power rankings here because, well, the top 3 feel like they're in the right spots. Gen.G, HLE, and T1 are 1, 2, and 3, respectively. Until proven otherwise, it's just pretty easy to be able to put them in that order. But, Nongshim and DK, yes, they struggled this week. I just have to imagine they're going to be able to get better. Neither looked particularly better than the other in their 0-2 weeks, so for me, they end up staying in their same spots. But the bottom of the standings is shaking up quite a bit. KT is going to jump all the way back up to number 6. We've kind of been waiting for a reason to give a team number 6 and to feel confident about it. Nobody's really done that so far this split. BNK FearX is the closest that we have come, but right now KT feel like they are finally starting to figure something out, and especially with the week that they had, for now, I am tentatively putting them at number 6. And I feel okay about that. I think they should be a playoff team. They've always been the team we've been waiting to figure things out to get to that number 6 spot because it is so easy to be able to grab it if you are even remotely consistent. But KT finally feel like they're locking themselves in. BFX, though, right on their tail. They're going to jump back up to number 7 after kind of a disappointing week in week 5. I think they bounced back well here in week number 6. That win over Bro definitely kind of securing them that number 7 spot. Speaking of Bro, because of that loss to BFX, falls down to number 8. I don't think there's a huge difference between BNK FearX and OK BRION, but they're 7 and 8 for me, and DRX, just with their inconsistency, has to go all the way back down to number 9 after looking pretty good in week number 5. DNF is, of course, still number 10, even despite their victory over Nongshim. I just can't fully invest into this team until they can prove they can do it more than just once. So for now, those are my power rankings. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comments section below. Always curious to know whether you guys agree or disagree with my takes, but let's go ahead and get into my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 6. Player of the week for me, it's going to go to Perfect, the top laner for KT Rolster. Rolster, the reinserted top laner for KT Rolster. To me, he was a difference maker this week by a pretty large margin. Not only was he exceptionally good in that series against Dplus KIA, but both games against DNF, he was also very valuable. I have the Jace game listed here, but the Yorick game in game number 2 as a split push threat that really took all of the attention of DNF. Like, Perfect was incredible this week. He was everything you could want out of a KT top laner, and to me, he was the most valuable player in the entire league in the small sample size. I just need him to be able to keep it up. We know this guy has the talent to be a very good player at this level, but he's just not been able to put it out on the Rift game over game. It's nice to see that that was possible, at least here in the small sample of 1 week. So he's my player of the week. My honorable mentions, Duro, the support for Gen.G. Man, I really wanted to give Duro the player of the week, but I thought Perfect was just a little bit more individually valuable to his team. The thing that held Duro back is ironically the fact that the rest of his team was phenomenal across this week, and I just don't think he added as many. Like, they would have won without Duro. You know, Gen.G would have still dominated, but KT probably wouldn't have won nearly as easily without Perfect, and we kind of had seen that in previous weeks. So that was the big difference maker for me, but Duro definitely player of the week worthy if you wanted to give it to him. And then Viper, the AD carry for Hanwha Life, was the other player that I really wanted to throw up here. Just an awesome week for Viper, kind of re-cementing himself as maybe the best AD carry in the world. But my dud of the week, unfortunately, has to go to someone. 2 phenomenal candidates this week, and 1 was lucky enough to miss out, but I'm going to give it to OK, the mid laner for DRX. No explanation for how he has played recently. Genuinely none. There's nothing I can give you that would make sense for why OK has been so awful over the past couple of weeks, but he has been. He's been one of the worst mid laners in the entire league, and especially because he was so good in winter. It's not just, oh, he came back to the LCK and the skill level was different. No, he was good in the LCK in the winter split. He's just been so bad in spring, and he was awful, like actively series losing for DRX this week, so he's gonna get dud of the week. Beryl is saved yet another week. He's the least valuable player in terms of my metrics right now in the LCK, and yet he has not received a dud of the week because somebody else has always stood out just a tad bit more. So Beryl escapes yet another week, but UK is my dud of the week, and Perfect is my player of the week. But that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we'll be covering the rest of the LCK year here in 2025, but we cover all 3 of the other major regions as well, so LTA North, LEC, and the LPL every single week on this channel. We also cover the NACL Tier 2 over in North America every single week. So if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all